A Norwegian sealing vessel approached White Island in the Arctic Barents Sea, a desolate fragment of rock and ice that appeared on no tourist routes and offered nothing worth claiming. The crew spotted something irregular on the shore: fabric, metal, shapes that didn't belong in this emptiness. When they landed and walked closer, they found a camp that had been frozen in time for 33 years. Two bodies lay in sleeping bags. A third sat propped against a rock. Surrounding them were scattered remnants of an expedition: scientific instruments, weapons, tin cans, and most remarkably, a camera with undeveloped film still inside. The photographs, when processed weeks later, would tell the story of how three men tried to fly to the North Pole in a hydrogen balloon, and instead discovered exactly how little the Arctic cared about human ambition. This is the story of the Andrée Expedition of 1897, how brilliant engineering met Arctic reality, and how the world's most audacious polar attempt became its most haunting mystery. July 11th, 1897, Danskoye Island, Svalbard. Salomon August Andrée stood beside a massive hydrogen balloon and performed final calculations. He was 43, chief engineer at the Swedish Patent Office, and he was about to attempt something insane disguised as science, reaching the North Pole by air. The logic seemed flawless in Stockholm's lecture halls. A properly designed hydrogen balloon could remain aloft for 30 days. Arctic winds blew generally northward during summer. Therefore, launch from Svalbard, drift with the wind across the pole, descend in Alaska or Russia. Simple physics applied to exploration, the kind of plan that worked perfectly until it encountered variables absent from textbooks. Andrée had spent 3 years preparing, had given lectures across Europe explaining why balloons represented the future, while other expeditions crawled across ice at walking pace, losing men to scurvy and cold. He would float above the chaos and comfort, covering in days what took others months. The critics were numerous and vocal. Fridtjof Nansen, who had reached closer to the pole than any living man, called it fundamentally flawed. But Andrée had mathematics, engineering expertise, and the certainty that comes from never experiencing the thing you're planning to do. The balloon, named the Eagle, stood 100 feet tall when inflated, holding 170,000 cubic feet of hydrogen, magnificent and terrifying. The envelope was double-layered varnished silk, supposedly impermeable to gas leakage. Beneath it hung a wicker gondola, fitted with everything three men might need: scientific instruments, navigation equipment, cameras, provisions for 4 months, and champagne for celebrating their arrival at the pole. The innovative feature was a drag rope system, long hemp lines trailing on the ice below for automatic altitude control and steering. As the balloon rose, more rope lifted, adding weight and pulling it down. As it descended, rope contacted ice, reducing weight and causing it to rise. Automatic equilibrium through physics. The ropes could theoretically steer up to 27 degrees from the wind line. Theoretically. What the system didn't account for was what happened when those ropes accumulated ice, froze to the surface, or dragged through pressure ridges. These weren't variables you could test in Sweden. You discovered them by dying. Andrée's crew had been carefully selected. Niels Strindberg, 24, physicist and photographer, engaged to be married. He designed specialized cameras that could function in extreme cold. Knut Frankel, 27, civil engineer and former military officer, would handle practical aspects: equipment, navigation, survival if they had to walk out. Both were younger than Andrée, both had zero polar experience, both trusted him completely. The expedition had royal backing. King Oscar II contributed funding. Alfred Nobel donated substantial money. Newspapers treated it as Sweden's heroic contribution to polar exploration. When the Eagle was transported to Svalbard, crowds cheered at Stockholm Harbor. The pressure to succeed was immense. National pride was invested. Turning back would mean explaining failure to a king and a public expecting triumph. The first attempt had been 1896, but winds never cooperated. Andrée waited all summer, then returned to Sweden with the balloon unused and the public disappointed. He spent winter promising that 1897 would be different, implying he'd launch regardless of imperfect conditions. Another delay was unthinkable. July 1897. The Eagle had been inflated for days, hydrogen slowly leaking through the silk faster than calculations predicted. In ideal circumstances, Andrée would repair the envelope and start fresh, but the Swedish gunboat transporting them needed to depart before ice blocked navigation. Launch now or wait another year. On July 10th, wind shifted southerly. Not perfect, but close enough. Andrée made the fatal decision. They would launch tomorrow. July 11th, 1:43 p.m. The mooring ropes released. The Eagle lifted smoothly, rising to 200 feet while the support crew cheered. The balloon drifted north over water, exactly as planned. The last time anyone who knew what happened would see them alive. What the watchers couldn't see was that catastrophe had already occurred. As the Eagle crossed the shoreline, the screw mechanisms holding the drag ropes detached. The exact reason remains debated: defective screws, improper securing, unexpected stresses. 2 of 3 main ropes fell away, plunging into the Arctic Ocean. With them went the steering system, altitude control, and several hundred kilograms of ballast. The balloon shot upward from 200 feet to over 2,000. Inside the gondola, Andrée felt the rapid ascent and understood immediately. Without drag ropes, they couldn't steer. Without altitude control, they'd drift at whatever height physics determined. The hydrogen was already leaking. They just lost the 2 innovations that made this theoretically feasible. The rational decision: abort. Release hydrogen, descend while still close to Svalbard, accept embarrassment but survive. Andrée didn't abort. The balloon moved north toward the pole. Wind seemed favorable. They still had 1 drag rope. Perhaps they'd get lucky. The fear of public failure proved stronger than the fear of Arctic death. The Eagle drifted north. Svalbard disappeared. Ahead lay ice that had killed better prepared men. Strindberg photographed everything with his specialized cameras: the balloon's shadow on ice, the trailing rope, the vast emptiness. Technical skill evident in every image. Sharp focus despite movement, proper exposure despite extreme light. These photographs would survive 33 years and eventually show the world exactly what he'd seen before dying. The first day's diary entries were optimistic. Good speed, favorable direction, the Arctic spreading below like a blank page. This was the dream. But the balloon was dying. Hydrogen leaked continuously. Moisture condensed and froze on the envelope, adding weight. By the second day, the Eagle flew lower. The remaining drag rope contacted ice intermittently, accumulating ice, pulling them down further. July 12th, 24 hours after launch, Andrée's entries became technical, concerned. The balloon descended whether they wanted it to or not. They dropped ballast, sandbags reserved for emergencies. Each provided temporary lift, but the underlying problem remained. The balloon lost gas faster than they could compensate. The Eagle began bouncing on the ice, hitting surface, lifting slightly, crashing down again. Each impact damaged the gondola, threw men against wicker walls, destroyed equipment they'd need if forced to abandon ship entirely. July 14th, 1897, 65 hours after launch. The Eagle descended for the final time. No explosion, no catastrophic failure, just inevitable conclusion. The gondola hit ice and stayed down. The envelope settled around them like a collapsing tent. They'd traveled approximately 300 miles north-northeast from Svalbard, nowhere near the pole, nowhere near Alaska, nowhere near anything except endless ice. Andrée, Strindberg, and Frenkel climbed out onto the Arctic ice pack and assessed their situation. They'd expected to be heroes. They were now 3 men on floating ice, hundreds of miles from human settlement, with provisions meant for a balloon journey, but facing a walking expedition across terrain that routinely killed experienced polar travelers. They consolidated supplies from the wreck. The gondola had protected most provisions. They had sleeping bags, tent, instruments, cameras, exposed photographic plates, weapons, ammunition, and food for 4 months if carefully rationed. 4 months should suffice to walk to Franz Josef Land, the nearest known land. Other explorers had made similar journeys. Difficult, dangerous, but possible. What they didn't know, the ice beneath them drifted south almost as fast as they could walk north. Their navigation would be defeated by the reality that their route constantly moved. The Arctic was about to demonstrate why engineering confidence meant nothing against elemental physics. On July 14th, Andrée wrote in his diary, "We think we can well face the journey that lies before us." The last moment any of them believed they would survive. The ice beneath their feet was moving. This fundamental reality, that the Arctic ice pack wasn't solid ground but floating crust constantly drifting with currents, would determine everything. Andrée, Strindberg, and Frenkel understood this intellectually. What they didn't understand was the psychological horror of walking north for 8 hours, only to wake the next morning farther south than when they started. July 14th, 1897. The wrecked Eagle lay collapsed like a dying animal, silk already freezing into the surface. The 3 men stood beside their destroyed dream and began the work of survival. No time for despair. The Arctic didn't care about disappointment. Andrée organized salvage with systematic precision, scientific instruments carefully packed. Sextant, chronometer, thermometers meant for triumphant observations, now for navigating retreat. Strindberg wrapped photographic plates individually, storing them in watertight containers. Someday, someone might find them. The photographs would tell the story even if the men couldn't. Food inventory, 4 months of provisions, pemmican, chocolate, powdered milk, Melon's baby food, butter, flour. Arctic explorers had survived on less, but 4 months assumed continuous walking toward safety. not accounting for the ice itself working against them. Weapons were plentiful: rifles, shotgun, revolvers, hundreds of rounds. Polar bears would follow, test them, wait for weakness. The rifles weren't optional. By July 17th, they'd built crude sledges from the balloon's framework and were ready to move. The first steps away from the wreckage felt significant, committing to survival, refusing to wait for death. Andrée calculated their position: approximately 82 degrees, 56 minutes north. Franz Josef Land lay southeast. Russian archipelago, their best chance. The distance was intimidating, but not impossible. 15 miles per day would get them there in weeks. 15 miles per day. This number would haunt them. The ice pack was broken chaos. Pressure ridges where ice sheets had collided, sometimes 20 feet high. Leads of open water cutting across their route. Snow hiding irregularities that could turn ankles or collapse entirely. The sledges caught on everything, requiring all 3 men to haul them over obstacles. After 8 hours of brutal labor on July 17th, Andrée took a position reading 6 miles southeast. Good progress. They made camp with the satisfaction of forward movement. The next morning he took another reading and discovered the horror. During the night the ice had drifted northwest. They'd lost 4 of the 6 miles. Actual progress, 2 miles after a full day of exhausting labor. This was the mathematics that would break them. Walking 15 miles meant actual progress of 5 miles, sometimes less, occasionally negative if drift was strong. At that rate, Franz Josef Land would take months. Their 4-month supply suddenly seemed desperately inadequate. Andrée didn't share this calculation immediately. Perhaps he hoped the drift would improve. Perhaps he couldn't face speaking the reality aloud. They were losing a race against their own supplies. They continued. Wake, eat cold breakfast, pack sledges, march 8 to 10 hours, camp, cook, sleep while the sun circled overhead. Every day the same brutal labor with diminishing returns. July 22nd, 1 week after leaving the Eagle. 45 miles of actual walking. Net progress, 15 miles. Andrée's diary entries became shorter, more technical. The optimism was gone, replaced by data recording reality. The terrain worsened. Ancient pressure ridges forming walls requiring hours to navigate. Sledges unpacked, hauled up piece by piece, repacked. Progress slowed to a crawl. Polar bears appeared. First one, then several, following at distance. Patient, experienced hunters waiting for opportunity. Frankel shot the first bear on July 25th. The animal had approached camp during sleep. The rifle shot echoed across ice, and the bear collapsed 50 yards from the tent. They butchered it with tools meant for science, loaded meat onto already straining sledges. Fresh bear meat tasted better than pemmican. It was also potentially lethal. Polar bear liver contains toxic levels of vitamin A, enough to cause hypervitaminosis A. The body literally poisons itself. Symptoms include dizziness, nausea, peeling skin. Severe cases cause organ failure. There's no record of whether they ate liver immediately. Later evidence suggests they consumed bear meat extensively, possibly including liver. The symptoms would come later, confusing and debilitating. August arrived. 2 weeks of walking. Net progress, 30 miles. The food situation was critical. The drift was relentless. Andrée made a desperate decision, changed destination. Instead of Franz Josef Land southeast, they'd aim for 7 islands north of Svalbard. Closer, requiring less progress against drift. It was acknowledging their original plan had failed. The new heading meant turning southwest, traveling with the drift. Progress improved immediately. 10 miles, 12 miles, 15 miles of actual distance. The change felt like victory. What they didn't realize, heading southwest meant abandoning any possibility of reaching land before winter. They were chasing a moving target while supplies diminished. Weather deteriorated. August brought storms. Wind turning the tent into torture, snow burying equipment overnight, temperatures dropping below -10. They'd lie in sleeping bags while fabric cracked like gunshots, wondering if seams would hold. Between storms, they walked. Every polar bear killed meant food and additional weight. The mathematics constantly recalculating. Calories versus load, speed versus endurance, immediate need versus long-term planning. August 17th, 1 month since the crash. Over 200 miles walked. Net progress toward 7 islands, 60 miles. 1/3 of supplies consumed. The mathematics was improving, but still brutal. Then the ice began breaking up. They'd reached where permanent pack ice met seasonal ice. Thinner, more mobile, broken into flows separated by open water. The solid ice was fragmenting into islands. They were forced onto a large floe, perhaps a mile across, and watched as it drifted beyond their control. They'd gone from agonizing slowness to being passengers, traveling wherever the ocean took them. Agency was gone. The days on the floe had a strange, static quality. They couldn't walk, so they hunted. Seals at breathing holes, polar bears following. Their camp became surrounded by butchered carcasses, blood on ice, the smell attracting more predators, in a cycle they couldn't escape. September arrived. The midnight sun began setting, darkness returning, winter coming, and they were still drifting, not toward land or safety, just toward the statistical certainty that supplies would run out. On September 12th, after a month drifting, they spotted land. White Island, desolate rock and ice barely qualifying as land, but solid ground. The floe was drifting past. This might be their only chance. They loaded sledges frantically, abandoned everything non-essential, dragged remaining supplies across breaking ice toward shore. The ice cracked beneath them, open water appearing, but they kept moving because stopping meant missing the island entirely. They reached White Island on September 17th, 1897. Solid ground, stable terrain, the end of months on ice that betrayed them with every step. It should have felt like salvation. Instead, it was a prison. White Island offered no food, no shelter, no possibility of rescue, simply the place where they would stop moving and start dying. They'd traveled over 400 miles from where the Eagle crashed, survived impossible circumstances, refused to give up, and arrived nowhere, a frozen rock where ships never came. Andrée's last diary entry before the island was characteristically technical. Position, weather, supplies remaining. No despair, no fear, just data. The engineer recording variables until the end. They began building camp as September darkness gathered. Behind them lay 3 months of brutal survival. Ahead lay Arctic winter with diminishing supplies and no escape. The photographs would preserve everything. The bodies would wait 33 years. And the story would eventually emerge to show the world what happened when brilliant men with perfect plans met the Arctic's indifferent mathematics. White Island was half a mile long, a quarter-mile wide, a fragment of rock and ice so insignificant most maps didn't mark it. No vegetation, no animals lived here permanently. It existed only as a geographic coordinate, notable for nothing, except that it would become a tomb. September 17th, 1897. Andrée, Strindberg, and Frankel dragged sledges onto rocky shore and stood on ground that wouldn't move for the first time in months. The relief of stability lasted perhaps an hour before reality became clear. They'd escaped drifting ice only to trap themselves on an island where rescue was statistically impossible. September in the Arctic meant winter's approach. Temperatures dropping, storms increasing, the brief summer window slamming shut. They had weeks before conditions became lethal. The question wasn't whether they'd survive winter. The question was how long they'd last. They established camp near the shore. The tent went up with practiced efficiency. 3 months of Arctic living had made them expert at survival's mechanics even as their bodies failed. Remaining supplies were inventoried with grim precision. Food for 6 weeks if carefully rationed. Fuel, ammunition, scientific instruments that no longer serve purpose except as artifacts. Strindberg photographed the camp. The images show pathetic equipment scattered on barren rock, the tent impossibly fragile against landscape. These weren't expedition photographs anymore. They were evidence for whoever found the bodies. First priority, shelter improvement. The tent provided minimal protection, but winter storms would shred it. They began constructing something more permanent, rocks piled as windbreaks, wrecked sledges as framework, the boat from the Eagle converted to partial roof. The work was exhausting. Their bodies were depleted from months of inadequate nutrition and constant strain. Every stone lifted required energy they couldn't spare, but the alternative was freezing to death when the first major storm hit. Bears found them within days. White Island was part of their hunting territory. The animals appeared at camp perimeter, massive and patient, understanding the humans were trapped and weakening. Frankel shot one on September 20th. The bear had approached too close, showing boldness that meant it was considering attack. Another several hundred pounds of meat lay outside their shelter. They butchered it mechanically, added meat to supplies, waited for the next to appear. The bear meat was sustenance and poison. Fresh meat provided desperately needed calories and fat. But the toxic liver, possible trichinosis from undercooked meat, the sheer quantity they consumed, their bodies were being fed and damaged simultaneously. Strindberg's diary entries from late September show the first signs something was medically wrong. Fatigue beyond normal exhaustion, stomach problems, headaches. Brief clinical entries, but symptoms suggested their bodies were failing from causes beyond simple starvation. October arrived. The sun set for the first time in months, not the midnight sun's brief dip, but actual darkness, hours of night, increasing daily. The psychological impact was profound. Darkness meant cold, isolation, the end of any possibility a passing ship might spot them. Temperature dropped below -20 Celsius. Tent fabric became brittle with frost. Condensation from their breath froze on every surface. They'd wake with sleeping bags frozen to tent floor, exhaled moisture creating ice that had to be chipped away each morning. The shelter helped, but couldn't stop cold infiltrating everything. Frostbite on hands despite gloves, feet suffering despite layers. The cold was relentless, patient, working through every defense. Food rationing became desperate. 6 weeks of supplies, but their bodies burned calories fighting cold. Brutal mathematics: reduce rations and weaken faster, or maintain rations and run out sooner. Either path led to the same destination. Strindberg's hands shook when he wrote now. The entries became shorter, harder to read. On October 4th, he noted chest pains. On October 6th, severe weakness. His handwriting deteriorated with each entry, the careful script of a trained scientist degrading into barely legible scrawl. October 7th, 1897. Strindberg made his last diary entry. Lit Batra. A little better. 2 words in Swedish. A lie or delusion. He wasn't better. He was dying, and perhaps knew it, and chose to write hope instead of despair. He died that night or the next day. The exact moment is unknown. When his body was found 33 years later, he was in a sleeping bag, positioned carefully. Andrée and Frankel had time to prepare him, to arrange him with whatever dignity remained. They buried their companion in the Arctic that had killed him, and understood their own deaths were coming. The loss of Strindberg broke something fundamental. Not just a companion gone, but proof that survival was illusion. If the youngest, strongest among them could die, the others had no chance. Whatever hope they'd maintained through impossible circumstances shattered. Frankel's diary continued sporadically for perhaps a week. The entries are fragmentary, confused. He noted burying Strindberg, noted deteriorating weather, noted feeling weak. The handwriting suggests physical collapse, words trailing off, sentences incomplete, entire pages blank where he apparently lacked strength to write. His last entry mentioned foot pain. Severe frostbite, likely, the kind that turns flesh black and dead, that makes walking impossible, that signals the body shutting down extremities to preserve core temperature just a little longer. Frankel died outside the shelter. His body was found yards from the main camp, suggesting he'd attempted some task, checking supplies, hunting, or perhaps simply walking away to die alone rather than burden Andrée. The snow partially buried him, then wind exposed the remains again. He lay frozen in position of someone who'd fallen and couldn't rise. Andrée was alone. How long he survived after Frankel died is unknown. Days, possibly a week. His diary continued briefly, entries that were later too degraded to read fully, ink and paper damaged by decades of ice. But his final position told the story. He was found propped against a rock face near the shelter, diary nearby, rifle within reach. He'd faced outward toward the ice. Even dying, the engineer's mind had maintained some form of order. The scientific specimens were stored carefully. Photographic plates protected in watertight containers. Navigation instruments organized. The last thing Salomon Andrée likely saw was the Arctic landscape that had defeated him, the ice that had sabotaged every plan, the emptiness that had swallowed his ambition. He'd believed technology could conquer this, that engineering and intellect could overcome nature's indifference. The Arctic had responded with physics, cold that destroyed tissue, starvation that consumed muscle, isolation that prevented rescue, simple elemental mathematics that didn't care about human brilliance or courage or determination. By mid-October 1897, all 3 men were dead. The camp fell silent. Snow buried the bodies. Ice entombed the equipment. Winter arrived with storms that would have killed any living thing. The polar bears returned, scavenged what they could reach, scattered some remains. Nature reclaimed what it had taken. Within months, the camp was invisible, another forgotten fragment of human ambition erased by the Arctic. Years passed, decades. The world forgot about Andrée's expedition. Search parties had looked, found nothing, gave up. Memorial services were held, life continued. Technology advanced in ways that vindicated Andrée's vision. Aviation developed, planes crossed oceans, eventually flew routinely over the Arctic. His dream of aerial polar exploration became mundane reality, but he wasn't alive to see it. White Island remained unchanged. The camp stayed frozen, preserved by the same conditions that had killed its occupants. The tent collapsed but protected what lay beneath. The bodies mummified in cold and dryness. The photographs survived in their containers. The diaries waited, frozen, readable. 33 years is long enough for everyone who knew the dead men personally to themselves die or grow old. Long enough that discovery would be archaeology, not rescue. August 6th, 1930. A Norwegian sealing vessel approached White Island. The crew spotted something irregular on shore. Fabric, metal, shapes that didn't belong. When they landed and walked closer, they found a camp frozen in time. 2 bodies in sleeping bags, one propped against rock. Equipment scattered but preserved, and most remarkably, cameras with undeveloped film. The photographs, when processed, showed everything. The balloon launch, the ice crossing, the desperate march, the final camp. Strindberg's technical skill had created a visual record that survived 3 decades of Arctic cold. The diaries told the rest, the hope, the mathematics of failure, the slow realization that survival was impossible, the last entries trailing off into silence. The bodies were returned to Sweden. King Gustav V attended the funeral. Thousands lined Stockholm streets. The men who'd departed as adventurers returned as relics, their story finally complete. White Island had kept its secret for 33 years. The Arctic had taken 3 lives and preserved the evidence perfectly. And the world learned what happened when brilliant men with magnificent plans met nature's indifferent mathematics. The eagle had fallen in 1897. The truth emerged in 1930. And the question remained, was it courage or madness that sent them into the sky above the Arctic, believing they could succeed where the ice itself worked against them? Perhaps both. Perhaps that's what exploration requires. The inability to calculate certain failure, the refusal to accept that some places remain unconquerable, the human arrogance that sees emptiness as challenge rather than warning. Andrée, Strindberg, and Frankel died pursuing that arrogance. The Arctic buried them, time forgot them, and then decades later the ice gave them back. 33 years of Arctic cold, moisture cycles, ice formation, photographic emulsion from 1897 wasn't designed for this. The plates should have been ruined, the images lost, the visual record erased. But when Norwegian sailors carefully transported the cameras back to Stockholm and technicians processed the film in darkrooms, images appeared. Sharp, clear, perfectly exposed. Niels Strindberg's ghost reaching across 3 decades to show the world exactly what happened when the eagle fell. August 6, 1930. The crew of the Norwegian sealing vessel Brattvåg had approached White Island looking for fresh water. Crew member Olav Salin walked inland from shore and spotted something that didn't belong, a piece of fabric protruding from melting ice. He pulled at it and uncovered a sleeping bag. Inside was a body, mummified by cold, perfectly preserved. Salin shouted for his crewmates. They came running and began excavating the site with the urgency of men who understood they'd found something historic. Within hours, they'd uncovered the entire camp. 2 bodies, scattered equipment, diaries frozen solid, cameras with film still inside, scientific instruments carefully stored, everything the Arctic had buried in 1897, perfectly preserved, waiting. The ship's captain, Peter Eliasson, realized immediately what they'd found. He ordered everything photographed in situ before anything was moved. The crew worked carefully, treating the site like an archaeological dig. Every item was catalogued, every position noted. They were documenting history. When Brattvåg returned to Norway with the bodies and artifacts, the news exploded worldwide. Andrée found after 33 years. The mystery that had haunted polar exploration for 3 decades was suddenly, shockingly solved. The bodies arrived in Stockholm on October 5, 1930. Thousands lined the streets. King Gustav V attended the state funeral. 3 men who'd departed as adventurers returned as martyrs, their failure transformed by time into sacrifice. Sweden buried them with honors reserved for heroes, but the real revelation came from the photographs. Strindberg had been meticulous. His cameras had captured everything: the eagle floating above Svalbard at launch, the ice spreading below from the gondola, the crashed balloon half buried in snow, images of the men hauling sledges across broken terrain, looking determined despite obvious exhaustion. A polar bear approaching camp in the distance, massive and patient. The tent on the ice floe, impossibly small against emptiness. The final photograph showed White Island, the crude shelter, supplies being organized. And then the record ended, presumably when Strindberg became too weak to operate the camera. When newspapers published these images, they created connection impossible through text alone. Readers could see the men's faces, the landscape that killed them, the precise moment when adventure became disaster. These were the first aerial photographs of the Arctic, taken by a dead man, developed 33 years later. One photograph became iconic worldwide: Strindberg's self-portrait on the ice, looking directly at the camera with expression impossible to read. Determination, despair, acceptance. The image appeared in newspapers across Europe and America. People stared at it, trying to understand what he'd been thinking, what he'd known about his own fate. The diaries filled in the narrative. Andrée's entries were technical: positions, weather observations, distances. Strindberg's were more personal, mentioning his fiancée Anna, describing the Arctic's terrible beauty. Frankel's were sparse, practical. Together they revealed the expedition's fatal mathematics: the balloon losing hydrogen from launch, the drag ropes detaching immediately, the ice drift defeating navigation constantly. Every assumption underlying the plan had proven catastrophically wrong, but they also revealed extraordinary competence. 3 months crossing terrain that killed experienced explorers. Discipline maintained, scientific observations continued, equipment organized carefully even facing death. They'd failed their objective, but demonstrated remarkable human endurance against impossible odds. The question obsessing everyone: what actually killed them? Medical examinations suggested combination of factors: severe malnutrition, hypothermia, possible disease. But investigators noticed something else: evidence of extensive bear meat consumption, possibly including liver. Polar bear liver contains lethal concentrations of vitamin A. Hypervitaminosis. It causes symptoms matching the diary's descriptions: fatigue, headaches, dizziness, peeling skin. They'd survived the crash, the ice, the bears themselves, only to be poisoned by eating what they'd hunted. The irony was crushing, or perhaps it was simply everything simultaneously: cold weakening them, starvation depleting them, poisoning accelerating decline, isolation preventing rescue. The Arctic doesn't kill with single causes. It kills with accumulated mathematics overwhelming human physiology. Anna Charlier received Strindberg's diary and personal effects 33 years after he'd departed. She'd waited years for news, eventually married another man, built a life. Now she held passages he'd written to her while dying, descriptions of the Arctic's beauty, promises to return, expressions of love from someone who knew he'd never see her again. She gave one interview describing him as brilliant, passionate, convinced of success. Then she refused to speak publicly about it again. Some grief is too private for newspapers. Later analysis revealed a haunting detail. The ice drift that frustrated their march had carried them within 50 miles of the 7 islands. If they'd remained on the drifting floe instead of seeking White Island's solid ground, currents might have carried them within sight of rescue. They'd abandoned the ice for stability, believing solid ground meant salvation. The decision to land on White Island had sealed their fate. They'd traded possible accidental rescue for certain isolated death. One photograph emerged during later examination of Strindberg's equipment that wasn't initially processed. An image showing all 3 men together outside their White Island shelter, posed formally despite obvious deterioration. Gaunt faces, ragged clothing, exhaustion visible in every line of their bodies. But they'd arranged themselves for the camera, creating a record. Engineers and scientists to the end, documenting the experiment even as it killed them. The photograph raised questions never answered. Who took it if all 3 were in frame? Delayed shutter? Someone else there briefly? Or was attribution wrong? The mystery remained unsolved, like much about the expedition. White Island kept the campsite visible for decades after discovery. Then ice and weather gradually erased it again. Occasional expeditions visited, photographed the location, then departed. The island remained what it had always been: barren rock where 3 men had died trying to survive. The Eagle's wreckage was never found. The balloon, gondola, equipment left at the crash site, all presumably sank through melting ice or were buried permanently. Only what they'd carried to White Island survived to tell the story. In Stockholm, a museum displayed the artifacts, the cameras that had preserved everything, the diaries with their increasingly desperate entries, the scientific instruments carefully maintained until the end, clothing deteriorated by 3 months of Arctic exposure, the sledge they'd hauled across impossible terrain. People filed past the exhibits in silence, staring at objects that had been touched by dead men, trying to comprehend what it meant to walk 300 miles across breaking ice, knowing you were probably dying. The photographs remained the most powerful artifacts. Strindberg's images showed the world what 19th century explorers had faced: the scale of the Arctic, the brutal beauty, the indifference to human ambition. These weren't romanticized paintings or imaginative illustrations. They were reality, captured by someone who'd lived and died in that reality. 90 years after the Eagle launched, aviation had made Andrée's dream routine. Aircraft crossed the Arctic in hours, making the journey he'd attempted in a balloon in weeks. He'd been right about the concept. Aerial polar exploration was feasible. He'd been wrong about the technology. Balloons couldn't do it, but planes could. The expedition's legacy wasn't the North Pole reached or territory claimed. It was the photographs surviving, the diaries telling truth, the story demonstrating both human capability and human limits. 3 men who'd believed planning could overcome nature. 3 months proving them wrong. 3 bodies preserved by the cold that killed them, waiting 33 years to deliver their message. The Arctic had taken them, kept them, and eventually returned them with their story intact. A century after the Eagle fell, people still study Strindberg's photographs, still read the diaries, still ask the same questions. Was it courage or madness? Should they have turned back? Could they have survived with different decisions? Perhaps these questions miss the point. Exploration requires believing you'll succeed where logic suggests failure, requires attempting the impossible because it's never been done, requires the arrogance to think you're different, better prepared, luckier than those who tried before. Andrée, Strindberg, and Frenkel had that arrogance. It carried them into the sky above Svalbard, and eventually to death on a barren island, but it also created a record that survived. Photographs showing the Arctic from above for the first time, diaries documenting conditions with scientific precision, artifacts demonstrating what humans can endure before physiology fails. They didn't reach the North Pole. They didn't survive. They didn't prove balloons could conquer the Arctic. But they showed the world exactly what happened when brilliant men with magnificent plans met nature's indifferent mathematics. And somehow, 33 years later, they managed to tell that story themselves. The ice kept their voices. The photographs preserved their vision. The diaries recorded their truth. And when the Arctic finally released them, they spoke.